7 years after a woman vanishes, a trail of evidence leads investigators to an isolated boat ramp on the Missouri River. They must pull proof of her murder from the murky river. In a rural Virginia county, a skull and a piece of jewelry are the only clues police have to identify a victim. But will it be enough to catch a killer? A woman is missing for weeks. When her body is discovered, the police must piece together their case from a few torn shreds of tape. When someone disappears, it's difficult for police to prove murder without a body. But today, forensic science can find justice for a victim months and sometimes even years after they have gone missing. Maryville, Missouri is a small Midwestern town. But in 1990, it was caught in the grip of a big city problem. To combat a growing methamphetamine industry, investigators sought help from those on the inside. Christine Elkins had been arrested for selling the drug. In exchange for immunity, Christine cooperated with authorities by helping to build a case against her supplier. She agreed to tape their next meeting with a microcassette recorder concealed in her clothing. On July 26, 1990, under the watchful eyes of investigators, Elkins met with the distributor at his house.
You got the stuff?
From the moment she walked in, Tony Emery, her dealer, was suspicious.
What are you doing?
He grabbed Christine and searched her.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I know you are.
He threatened to kill her if she ever betrayed him.
When you cool off, okay?
Agent Mike Schmitz headed up the case for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
She came back afterwards extremely upset, stating that he knew that I was wired. He attempted to locate the recorder. She was extremely upset.
Christine told agents that she was afraid for her safety. They urged her to stay away from Tony. When agents tried to listen to the tape, it was indecipherable. The case against Tony Emery would have to be made on informant testimony. A few weeks before Christine was scheduled to testify against him, police received a call from her mother. She hadn't heard from her daughter in several days, and she was worried. A search of Christine's house indicated no sign of a struggle. Her car, a maroon Oldsmobile, was gone. Missouri State Police worked with the ATF on the Emery narcotics case. Investigator Larry Bodenhammer.
Well, the investigation changed after her disappearance because after a period of time, it was like, well, where is she? You know, what has happened to her? Has she left on her own accord, or has something happened to her?
Investigators interviewed Christine's friends and acquaintances. One friend told police she'd seen her around 10 o'clock the night she disappeared. Christine had asked her to watch her son for a few minutes while she met someone. Christine made a chilling prediction as she left. If she wasn't back in a few minutes, she'd be in the morgue. No one had seen her since.
All right, I need to bring everybody up to date.
The ATF and the police now suspected that Tony Emery was behind her disappearance. He had a strong motive, but without evidence of an actual crime, authorities could not prove his involvement. 3 weeks later, Maryville police received a tip from a federal drug enforcement agent in Colorado.
Sergeant Strong.
A methamphetamine manufacturer facing time in federal prison wanted to make a deal.
Get our plans together and stuff.
He claimed he knew about the murder of a female informant in Maryville.
All right, that'll work.
Investigators
Talk to you later.
feared he was referring to Christine Elkins. Maryville police and ATF agents flew to Colorado to question James Witt. He told them he manufactured methamphetamine for Tony Emery and his cousin Herb Emery. He said he'd heard the two men talking about killing an informant in Missouri. In exchange for leniency, Witt agreed to meet Herb Emery and wear a wire. Authorities hoped their conversation would provide details of the alleged murder and possibly lead them to Christine Elkins. Three months after Christine's disappearance, Witt met Herb Emery in a restaurant parking lot. Agents listened to their conversation from a car nearby. Witt pretended he needed to get rid of a body and asked for advice. Herb Emery told him the best way to dispose of a body was to put it in the trunk of a car and sink it in a rock quarry. It was investigators' first clue. Using detailed maps, they identified rock quarries deep enough to conceal a car. But the Midwest, famous for its native limestone, had literally hundreds of quarries. To narrow their search further, they had to think like a killer.
If you've got a person in the trunk of the car, what would you do? Would you drive a long ways when it wasn't your car? You could break down. If you were to find a rock quarry, it would have to be something close. It would have to be something that you didn't have to drive. It's a very wet season. You wouldn't have to drive through a field because you might get stuck.
They focused on a 75-mile radius, but that still left hundreds of possibilities. Over the next several months, investigators systematically searched those rock quarries for a car containing a body. They found nothing. The ATF, the Missouri State Police, and Maryville Police considered the Emerys dangerous, but lacked sufficient evidence to support a murder charge. Setting up a task force, investigators devised a strategy to get them off the street until they could prove murder. Federal agents again used James Witt, this time to set up a methamphetamine buy. Herb and Tony Emery met Witt at a prearranged location. Agents observed as Tony Emery gave Witt $20,000 for several pounds of the drug.
ATF, on the floor!
They moved in to make the arrest.
Don't move. Get on the floor right now.
In the summer of 1991, Herb and Tony Emery were convicted of conspiracy to keep and sell methamphetamine. They were sentenced to 9 years in a federal penitentiary. With the Emerys in prison, authorities were able to focus on the disappearance and possible homicide of Christine Elkins. According to Maryville police investigator Randy Strong, Tony Emery was a dangerous man to cross.
The community had a great fear of Tony Emery. If we had a witness to him doing a crime, they simply wouldn't come forward, or they would back out of the case. No one wanted to talk about it because they were afraid of what he might do to them.
But with the Emery cousins safely behind bars, authorities hoped their associates would no longer be afraid to talk. And they had a lead. In their taped conversations, Herb Emery had told James Witt about a third man who was present the night of the murder.
ATF, we're looking for Bobby Miller.
Bobby Miller was a friend of Herb's in Colorado. But when investigators tried to question Miller, they got nowhere. Even from prison, the Emerys cast a frightening shadow. Investigators went to one of the Emery's rental properties mentioned in a monitored conversation between Herb Emery and James Witt. They suspected that this was the site where Christine had been murdered. The woman who answered the door confirmed that she rented the house from the Emerys. Once inside, investigators were dismayed to find the house had been gutted and remodeled.
Yeah, everything. Well,
If Christine had been murdered on the premises, all evidence of the crime had been destroyed. Out of options, the investigators re-examined their case files, looking for a clue, something they might have missed the first time, that would link the Emerys to Christine's murder. Investigators found phone records linking Bobby Miller to Herb Emery around the time Christine disappeared. They also learned that Bobby Miller had rented a truck near Maryville the night Christine was last seen. It suggested his involvement, but they had to find a way to get him to talk.
Yeah, this is pretty creepy.
In September 1996, 6 years after Christine's disappearance, police went back to Miller.
Okay, Bobby, you know why
They
you're
offered
here
him
today.
immunity in exchange for his testimony.
And your attorney has given us
On the
permission
advice
to
of his
get your
attorney,
statement.
Miller took the deal.
You really pin all this down?
Miller admitted he was outside Herb Emery's rental property the night Christine Elkins disappeared. He said he watched her go inside, where Herb and Tony waited. When he heard screams, he panicked and drove off. Investigators believed they knew what happened next. But without a body, making a murder case against the Emerys would be difficult, if not impossible. 7 years had passed since Christine Elkins' disappearance. The ATF and the Maryville, Missouri police had Bobby Miller's account of her murder, but no evidence to back it up.
Either one of these two.
And they were running out of time. The suspects in her disappearance, Tony and Herb Emery, were about to be paroled from prison. Determined to prevent their release, authorities scrutinized every facet of their case. They decided to take a closer look at the Emery's associates. Dana Kleiser wasn't directly involved with Emery or his drug ring. In fact, investigators interviewed him only because Tony had once dated his sister. According to Kleiser, Tony Emery arrived at his rural home the night Christine disappeared. He asked to borrow some gas, then asked Kleiser to show him a nearby boat ramp. Wary of Emery's reputation, Kleiser didn't ask any questions, but led him to a boat ramp on the Missouri River. Tony told him to wait several miles away. Pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Investigators now believed they knew the location of the car containing Christine's body.
We now realized that we had to try, at least plan, to recover a body out of the Missouri River. And I think the thing that was going through both of our minds was the Great Flood of 1993. And I know I was thinking that, unfortunately, Christine is probably in the Gulf someplace now after that flood.
The currents of the Missouri River are normally powerful enough to move something the size of a car great distances. During the 1993 floods, the river became a raging torrent that overflowed its banks and caused millions of dollars in damage.
He's going to have a map.
It was yet another long shot, but it was all investigators had to go on. To make a case against the Emerys, they had to find Christine's car. They enlisted the help of a non-profit organization called NecroSearch International. These Colorado-based scientists helped law enforcement around the world find clandestine graves and hidden evidence. When Clark Davenport, a forensic geophysicist with NecroSearch, arrived at the boat ramp, he'd already amassed a wealth of data.
Oh, at night, okay. Prior to coming out to take magnetic measurements, we looked at the make and model of the car, talked to the manufacturer to determine the mass of metal in the motor. We also looked at the currents in the river bottom conditions, river speed, the floods that happened since the car had gone into the river, and the float time from the manufacturer, how long they figured a car would float.
Armed with that information, NecroSearch scientists spent 2 days searching a 6-mile area adjacent to the boat ramp. They used a magnetometer, a torpedo-shaped device that measures changes in magnetic fields. Floating several feet below the river's surface, it takes readings every 2 seconds and recognizes large masses such as a car. Used in conjunction with global positioning satellites, the magnetometer enabled NecroSearch scientists to precisely pinpoint 5 locations where abnormal masses, or anomalies, were present on the riverbed.
I felt pretty confident that the anomalies were consistent with what I would expect from a car of that size.
The next day, investigators returned to the boat ramp with a team of divers. Fighting the murky river's current, the divers searched the 5 areas Davenport pinpointed as likely locations for the car. Within hours, one of the divers surfaced holding up a Missouri license plate. Against all odds, investigators had finally found Christine Elkins' car.
This was an incredible moment. It was kind of like Excalibur coming up out of the lake with the sword. You know, it's just amazing. Just the emotion that was involved in that. We knew that we were getting closer now. We were going to put closure on this case.
Divers attached steel cables to the car and pulled it from the water. It was sent to a Maryville garage for processing. Inside, forensic examiners discovered a piece of wood wedged between the driver's seat and the accelerator. In the trunk, they found bones wrapped in carpet padding. Using hospital x-rays, the medical examiner confirmed that they had finally found the remains of Christine Elkins. The autopsy revealed a large hole in the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. Christine had apparently been beaten to death. Investigators had the physical evidence they needed to charge the Emerys with murder. They believed Tony found out Christine was going to testify against him and offered her money to disappear. She was too terrified to turn him down. But when she went to the house that night, the Emerys had other plans. Once inside, Tony and Herb attacked Christine. Tony dealt the lethal blow, striking her in the head with a heavy flashlight. Her body was wrapped in carpet padding, put in the trunk of her car, and driven to the boat ramp. There, Tony rigged the accelerator and sent the car down the ramp into the river. Herb Emery pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Tony Emery was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Maryville, authorities knew the name of the victim and suspected killers, but struggled for 7 years to find her body. In a rural Virginia county, investigators had to identify a body before the search for a murderer could even begin. Amelia County is a sprawling community, located in the rolling hills of western Virginia. It's a neighborly area with a low crime rate. Not the place for murder. In 1990, while hunting for deer, a man made a gruesome discovery. On an embankment near a small creek, he found a human skull. He took it to the Amelia County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Jimmy Weaver examined the skull. Its condition told him it had been outside for some time. The presence of a long reddish hair, as well as the skull's small size and features, suggested that the victim was probably female. Two opposing holes in the skull were consistent with entry and exit wounds made by a single bullet. Sheriff Weaver and his deputy went out to the scene.
On my way in, I was trying to think of who it could be. There was no one in Amelia missing. No one had called me. Amelia is a small, close county. If something happens, we know right away.
After securing the area, Weaver conducted a thorough search. They found more bones, jewelry, part of a blanket, and a piece of denim. Concerned that animals might have scattered additional clues, the investigators broadened their search. They soon discovered what appeared to be an arm bone and a gold bracelet. The evidence seemed to confirm Sheriff Weaver's original theory that the victim was female. Weaver sent the evidence to the Virginia State Medical Examiner's office in Richmond for analysis. Chief Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro examined the remains. The skull told her a great deal about the victim.
First, it showed that it was a young white female. Second, it showed that it had a gunshot wound and that there was injury related to this gunshot wound, and that the trajectory of where this bullet went in and where it fractured on the other side indicated it had a path that was lethal.
As the examination of the skeletal remains continued, the medical examiner's office was able to establish that the victim had been 5 feet 2 to 5 feet 4 inches tall, with reddish blonde hair. The description was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the state of Virginia. The search was on for any missing women matching Amelia County's Jane Doe. Now, Sheriff Weaver could only hope and wait. In January 1990, the Sheriff's Department in Amelia County, Virginia, needed a lead to establish the identity of skeletal remains found in an isolated area. It wasn't long in coming. Police in Chesapeake, Virginia, reported that a woman who fit the victim's description had been missing for 8 months. Dental records confirmed the victim was 29-year-old Regina Butkowski, known to her friends as Jeannie. The same day, deputies showed Jeannie's mother the jewelry recovered from the scene. She identified it as her daughter's. Chesapeake police forwarded the Butkowski case files to Amelia County. As Weaver reviewed them, he learned the circumstances of Jeannie's disappearance. On the evening of May 6, 1989, Jeannie's roommate discovered that the front door of their house had been kicked in. Concerned, she checked the parking lot for Jeannie's car. It wasn't there. She called Jeannie's mother, who said she'd last spoken to her daughter at 10:45 the night before. One fact in the police files immediately caught Sheriff Weaver's attention: Jeannie's stormy relationship with a man named Pernell Jefferson. Jeannie had met Jefferson at a local gym. He became her personal trainer, and the two dated for several months. When Jefferson became too possessive, Jeannie tried to distance herself from him, but he refused to back off.
One of the things that he had somewhat of an obsession with was with Regina. He was not going to accept the fact that she wasn't his.
Jefferson's obsession had become frighteningly clear when he allegedly kidnapped Jeannie in March 1989. But by an amazing stroke of luck, more than 7 minutes of that struggle had been recorded on her home answering machine.
It was a very dramatic tape. No one really knew how it was recorded, but it was. And it was a situation where you would hear her telling, "No, Purnell, don't hurt me, don't do things." And it proceeded on. You could hear noise in the background. And probably one of the most dramatic things of it is that at one time you heard this tremendously deep sob from Regina.
Weaver learned that Jeannie's roommate told Jefferson about the tape and threatened to call police. He released Jeannie. She refused to press charges against him, however, out of fear he might take out his anger on someone close to her. 2 months later, Jeannie Butkowski again disappeared. Sheriff Weaver focused the investigation on Purnell Jefferson. A lead came in from Jeannie's parents. They had received a letter regarding their daughter's car from an apartment complex in Richmond, Virginia, 130 miles away from Jeannie's home. The manager of the apartments alerted them that Jeannie's car had been sitting in the parking lot for 6 months. Investigators examined her car, hoping for clues to link Jefferson to the murder. They were disappointed. During the time the car had been there, it had been subjected to the elements.
When they had the flood in Richmond, it had been submerged in the flood. So a lot of the evidentiary value from that vehicle was lost.
But a new lead was quickly established. A resident of the apartment complex told investigators that he knew a man who used to drive the car. Investigators soon learned that Jeannie's car had changed hands several times. They eventually traced it to a man named Darrell Jones, who was incarcerated in Henrico County. Jones told deputies he bought the car from a local man named Wes Green. Green was with a stranger who claimed the car belonged to his girlfriend. He'd taken it away from her and driven it up from Chesapeake because he was angry with her. Investigators suspected the stranger was Purnell Jefferson. They wanted to know more and believed Wes Green might hold the key. They just needed to find him. As evidence against Purnell Jefferson mounted, the Amelia County Sheriff's Department believed his friend, Wes Green, might know more about the murder of Jeannie Butkowski. Deputies quickly tracked Green down to an apartment complex in Richmond. When questioned, he admitted he helped Jefferson get rid of Jeannie's car. The officer persisted. Green added that Jefferson had borrowed a co-worker's car around the time Jeannie disappeared. If the car had been used to dispose of her body, it was probable that incriminating evidence had been left behind. Deputies went to the appliance rental store where Purnell Jefferson had once worked. A co-worker confirmed that on May 5th, the day Jeannie disappeared, Jefferson had borrowed his car. He didn't return the vehicle until late that night. A few days later, Jefferson went to lunch and never returned. Investigators obtained permission to search the employee's car. The search yielded incriminating results. Technicians found traces of lime, a corrosive substance that hastens decomposition. More importantly, they found a reddish blonde hair similar to the one found on Jeannie Butkowski's skull. The hair was sent to the crime lab for analysis. A comparison indicated the two hairs were consistent in texture and color. Investigators now had their first physical evidence connecting Jefferson to Jeannie Butkowski's murder. Sheriff Weaver swore out a warrant for the arrest of Pernell Jefferson on capital murder charges. Authorities traced Jefferson to Stuart, Florida, where he'd moved shortly after Jeannie's disappearance.
Get out! All right! Clear left! Move! Clear!
On February 3rd, 1990, a SWAT team burst into the suspect's home to find him hiding in a closet. They quickly took him into custody.
Don't move!
5 months later, Jefferson was extradited to Amelia County to stand trial for murder. Based on the evidence, investigators pieced together the events of the night Jeannie Butkowski died. On May 5th, 1989, Pernell Jefferson and Wes Green drove from Richmond to Chesapeake and broke into Jeannie's house as she slept. Jeannie struggled with Jefferson, who dragged her outside. He forced her into her own car and sped away. Green left separately. Although investigators never learned the precise location of her murder, they suspected Jefferson stopped at a remote area as he drove back to Richmond. He initially disposed of her body just outside the city. Fearing it might be discovered there, Jefferson recruited Wes Green to help him move the body to Amelia County, where they buried it in a shallow grave. Pernell Jefferson thought he'd covered his tracks, but he underestimated Sheriff Weaver and his deputies.
He thought that he would bring her out to a rural county to where probably there was a rural law enforcement agency that wouldn't find it, or if they did, wouldn't solve it.
On March 28, 1991, Pernell Jefferson stood trial in Amelia County for killing Jeannie Butkowski. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years. Wes Green was also charged and convicted for his role in Jeannie's abduction. In a murder investigation, police often discover the killer was close to the victim. But when a killer preys on a stranger, he is far more difficult to find. Nestled at the junction of two rivers, Wichita, Kansas is an all-American city with a touch of Old West charm. In this story, some of the names have been changed. On September 17, 1995, a woman phoned the Wichita police to report a missing person. She said her friend, Jodie Mccown, got into a maroon car on South Broadway around 1:30 the night before and hadn't returned. Most missing persons turn up within a few days, but South Broadway is a tough neighborhood plagued by drugs and prostitution. The Wichita police immediately began looking for Jodie Mccown. Detectives contacted Becky Sims, the woman who called in the missing persons report, hoping she could give them more information. Becky told them she was with Jodie and her boyfriend, Keith Perry, the night Jodie disappeared. A man drove up in a maroon car and told them he was looking for drugs. He introduced himself as Chester Higginbotham. Jodie and Keith got into the car to talk to him. Becky heard the man offer Jodie $200 to help him find drugs. Jodie was reluctant, but Keith said they needed the money. He took $100 and got out of the car. Detective Dana Gouge recalls Becky was uneasy about the unusual circumstances of Higginbotham's request.
She was very suspicious of the situation because of the amount of money that was offered to Jodie in this situation. She found it very strange. So strange that she wrote down the tag number of the car.
investigators traced the license plate to a resident named Matthew Murphy, who lived in the nearby town of Newton. They wondered who Chester Higginbotham was and how he was connected to Murphy. They ran a background check on the two men.
I'm working on that now.
They also ran a background check on Jodie's boyfriend, Keith Perry. They soon learned he had several outstanding drug warrants. During questioning, Perry confirmed Becky Sims's account of Jodie's disappearance, with one major difference. He denied encouraging her to join Higginbotham in the car. Suspicious of Perry's involvement, detectives obtained a warrant to search his apartment. They didn't find anything to implicate him, but collected various items for possible DNA testing later. By now, investigators had the results from the background checks on Chester Higginbotham and Matthew Murphy. A comparison of fingerprints, photographs, and DMV records proved that Matthew Murphy and Chester Higginbotham were the same man. He had arrest records for burglary and theft going back many years under both names. In fact, there were several burglary charges pending against the Murphy alias in Kansas, as well as other states. The identity change and arrest records made Lieutenant Ken Landwehr of the Wichita Police Department highly suspicious.
When we find out that Matthew Murphy is an alias for Chester Higginbotham, it's again a clue that's going to show us that he's trying to hide his background, which has to mean that if he's hiding his background, there's probably something there that's more serious than burglaries and thefts.
Police called Higginbotham, who readily admitted he picked up Jodie Mccown on September 16th. But he said he dropped her off later and hadn't seen her since. Despite his claim, police were anxious to question him and search his residence.
We had hopes of being able to look through his house, try to determine whether or not he may have been involved in this, and also we had hopes that we would be able to find Jodie alive.
Because Higginbotham was the last person seen with Jodie, investigators were able to obtain a search warrant. Whatever he was hiding, investigators hoped to find the answers in his house. Wichita and Newton, Kansas police struggled to solve the disappearance of 28-year-old Jodie Mccown. She was last seen with a man named Chester Higginbotham. When investigators arrived at Higginbotham's house, nobody was there. Armed with a warrant, they began searching for clues. Detective T. Walton found nothing to suggest murder.
We were picking up fibers from carpeting. We were looking at his boots and his shoes. We were looking for a body, but we did not find a body inside the house.
Investigators were pondering their next move when a car pulled up in front of the house and a couple got out. The man calmly identified himself as Matthew Murphy and asked what was happening. Investigators produced a warrant and brought them to the station for questioning.
Have a seat in that chair.
Under interrogation, Murphy admitted his real name was Chester Higginbotham.
All right, Mr. Murphy, we're here to ask you a few questions.
He claimed he assumed an alias when he and his wife were placed into the federal witness protection program. According to Higginbotham, they were both witnesses in a mob-related murder case. Higginbotham reiterated his original account, that he picked up a girl fitting Jodie Mccown's description on September 16th. He said she was leaving town, so he dropped her off at the bus station around midnight.
Okay, we want you to...
To detectives, his story didn't quite ring true.
His times of dropping Jodie off were not consistent with the times that our bus stations were open here in Wichita, either the city buses or the trailway buses. By going in and questioning him about that, he was still insistent that that's what he did. We knew that that could not have been true.
At the investigators' request, Higginbotham agreed to submit blood, hair, and saliva samples in the event a DNA comparison was called for in the future. Detectives also spoke with his wife, Vicky. She told them she didn't know her husband's real name was Higginbotham and contradicted his assertion that they were in the witness protection program. Vicky also said her marriage was troubled and she believed her husband was seeing other women. When asked about the night Jodie Mccown disappeared, Vicky said she came home from work and found a note from her husband. He said he was going to pick up parts for a car he was working on at a rented garage. When he hadn't arrived home by 3 a.m., Vicky drove to the garage to look for him. She said she caught him with a girl in his car. Although her husband wouldn't let her near the vehicle, she could see a girl with brown hair in the passenger seat. When Vicky confronted her husband, he claimed he was only giving the girl a ride. Vicky told him to come home immediately and then left. She said her husband arrived at the house about 5 minutes later. Based on the contradictory information obtained from Vicky, investigators questioned Higginbotham again. When they asked him about the girl at the garage, he claimed she was a friend from a local bar. But detectives suspected it was Jodie Mccown. Armed with a warrant, police searched Higginbotham's rented garage. Inside the suspect's car, they found a wad of green duct tape with hair stuck in the adhesive. Investigators also collected a white button with thread, black zip ties, a roll of green duct tape, and yellow rope. Detectives now believe Chester Higginbotham had murdered Jodie Mccown, but they still couldn't prove it without a body. Over the course of several weeks, investigators conducted a thorough search of the area surrounding his rented garage, but they didn't find anything. Without Jodie Mccown's body, it appeared Chester Higginbotham might be getting away with murder. Weeks after her disappearance, Wichita police were no closer to finding Jodie Mccown. Though they suspected a man named Chester Higginbotham was involved in her disappearance, they had no solid proof that a crime had even been committed. On October 11th, nearly a month after Jodie's disappearance, a county groundskeeper working on the outskirts of town made a grisly discovery. The decomposed body of a woman lay in a ditch by the side of the road. When investigators arrived, they believed they'd finally found Jodie Mccown. The victim lay face down. A sweater and various undergarments were found near the body. As they searched for clues, the scene yielded a wealth of physical evidence.
She had the black plastic zip ties on her. She had green duct tape, just like what was found in the shed, wrapped completely around her head, covering her nose and mouth area. The hands and feet were bound together with yellow rope that was similar to the rope that was all in the shed.
Fingerprint analysis confirmed the victim was Jodie Mccown. The medical examiner performed an autopsy and collected hair and fiber evidence from the body. She removed the duct tape for further analysis. Based on her findings, the medical examiner ruled the probable cause of death was asphyxiation caused by the duct tape covering the victim's nose and mouth. Due to the advanced decomposition of the body, the medical examiner was unable to determine whether Jodie had been sexually assaulted. And there was insufficient material for DNA analysis. Detectives would have to build their case on other evidence. At the Wichita Police Department Crime Lab, evidence technician Patrick Cunningham hoped the duct tape would lead investigators to her killer. Using a solution called gentian violet, Cunningham looked for latent prints left on the tape. When the dye comes into contact with human protein residues, like those left by fingerprints, a vivid purple stain appears. When the tape from Jodie Mccown's body was put into the gentian violet solution, the results were disappointing.
And when we examined the back side of it, near the torn edge, there were some partial fingerprint impressions in that area, but there wasn't enough minutia for comparative purposes.
Forensic examiners had one last chance to make their case against Chester Higginbotham. At the Sedgwick County Regional Forensic Science Center in Wichita, forensic examiner Gary Miller would use fracture analysis to try to prove the duct tape from Jodie's body came from the roll of tape in Higginbotham's rented garage. First, he painstakingly separated individual pieces from the tape recovered from Jodie's body. Then, he analyzed the torn edges to establish the sequence in which the pieces had been torn from the roll.
Upon aligning the torn edge, we can go and see that the fractures, such as a jigsaw puzzle, fits together, but we're also able to align that the spacing between these threads are consistent, and visually we can tell from the color they are consistent.
Miller's analysis proved that the roll of duct tape collected from Higginbotham's garage had been used to bind Jodie Mccown. Forensic scientists also compared fibers recovered from the victim's clothing with carpet fibers taken from Higginbotham's car. Under a microscope, the texture and color of the fibers were consistent. Detectives had finally established physical links between Jodie Mccown and Chester Higginbotham. Scientists then compared the button and thread found at the garage with those on Jodie Mccown's shirt. They carefully measured the buttons, noting similarities in size, design, and material. The threads from the garage and the victim's shirt were consistent. In the end, forensic science had given detectives enough evidence to make a homicide charge stick. Based on the evidence, police reconstructed the sequence of events on the night Jodie was murdered. They believe Chester Higginbotham took Jodie Mccown to the rental garage. He overpowered her, bound her with duct tape, and killed her. He then disposed of the body in a ditch by the side of the road. Chester Higginbotham, also known as Matthew Murphy, was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 40 years without the possibility of parole. Once, time and the elements could destroy evidence linking a killer to his victim. But forensic technology has found new ways around these obstacles. Investigators can overcome impossible odds and bring justice to murder victims who were long considered missing.